I call the member for Jagga Jagga.
Mr Speaker, I'm lucky that my electorate is home to one of Odyssey House's residential rehabilitation programs. In Lower Plenty, Odyssey House provides a place where people with drug and alcohol addictions and problems come to change their lives. I visited on Friday and I want to say a thank you to the residents and staff who spoke with me, because it was really helpful for me in understanding some of the big issues that are before this House. One of the residents who spoke with me, he'd been there for nearly a year, dealing with his drug and alcohol problems and turning his life around, and he explained to me where he'd come from. He told me how he'd had 2 jobs. His second job was as a jockey. His first job was to make sure he had enough alcohol and opium to get through the day. He told me how when he first arrived at Odyssey House, he was confronted, and what he was confronted by surprised me, because he told me he was confronted by being shown love and empathy. He'd never seen those before in his life. Imagine that, never been seen love and empathy. And in fact, what he had to learn to do at Odyssey House was to form relationships, was to build the sort of relationships that those of us who are lucky enough to have had a stable upbringing learn to form when we're actually very small. He'd been working hard on that, and he'd been working through his problems to where he's turning around his life and becoming a leader in the community there. Speaking to the staff at Odyssey House, they talked about how the people who came to the program there were often dealing with intergenerational trauma, an ongoing legacy of distrust, broken relationships, and a view of authority that sees only harm. These are people for who, if you begin with an approach of distrust, of suspicion, they'll shut down on you. They explained to me that it's not easy to turn your life around. You have to want it, and you have to be shown that it's possible. Odyssey's track record shows that it is possible, and that we need more of the approach that they are taking. And yet what we hear is that this government is proposing precisely the opposite. Instead of an approach that invites people to turn their lives around, to do the work they need to do to get back on track, that invites them in for help, they're looking for a punitive approach. At an approach that for those people who for all their life have been suspicious of authority and have been knocked down, get knocked down again by the system that's meant to help them. A proposal that's indiscriminate, ineffective and demeaning, drug testing for all on welfare. We've heard from medical experts that this simply won't work, that we should expect more crime, more family violence and more desperation. And what about the poor staff at Centrelink who are expected to enforce this? They're already overstretched. What's it going to be like when they're dealing with desperate people and forcing them into tests when they come into the office? Of course, the government would like us to think that this is just about a certain group of people in our community. But that's not the case. This type of program will affect single mums who are looking after their kids. It could affect people who've been retrenched and looking for a job, and those who are trying to return to the workforce. 1 in 4 people on New Start are over 55. There could be grandparents who are forced to take part in this policy, to urinate in a cup, to have their hair plucked or spit into a jar, just so that they can continue to help their families to put food on the table. We've seen this approach tried overseas in countries like New Zealand and the US, and it's been proven a failure. But let's get real about this. We know that the main reasons the government's proposing this approach is to distract, because it's all too easy to make vulnerable people the target when you don't have a plan. When you're in here dealing with political strategy and not the reality of people's lives. When you're in here thinking about how do you make up for the fact that Australia is struggling, our country's economic growth is at its slowest since the global financial crisis, when we're seeing wages stagnate, living standards and productivity going backwards, workers underemployed and new apprenticeships at their lowest level for 2 decades. There are people out there who genuinely need help, and they need help from this government. What I saw at Odyssey House was that the approach being proposed by this government will not be effective in supporting these people. It's time that this government decided that it was no longer focused on distracting from its lack of agenda, that it genuinely wanted to support people in need. It's time that the government moved away from thinking about new ways to humiliate and harass people who do want help and who want to get their lives on track. It's time the government put in a real plan to support people with drug and alcohol addictions.
Yeah.